Hi! In this video we're going to be talking about some of the evidence that supports the theory of natural selection. But first let's remind ourselves what the theory of natural selection is. In case you missed it, it's the idea that organisms who are best suited for their niche will be more likely to survive and pass on their traits to their offspring, thus making those organisms' traits more common in the next generation. So Darwin published his ideas, as you know, after working with a lot of other scientists and collecting a lot of data. He toyed with his ideas for a long time, but was very hesitant to publish. It wasn't until Alfred Wallace, who had similar experiences on a voyage in the South Pacific, wrote Darwin and told him of similar ideas. It was then that the two teamed up for the book called On Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. You'll notice the word evolution isn't actually in the title. His book basically proposed what natural selection was, and then he took it a little bit further and he said if organisms are constantly changing to be better suited for their environment, then we can backtrack that and say that organisms were much more similar in the past and therefore probably more related, actually related to some kind of similar origin of organisms. So when we look at the support, for the theory of natural selection, it's important to remember just what a theory is. Remember that in everyday language we use the word theory very loose to say something like an idea or a proposal or a hypothesis. In reality, though, in science, theories are much, much, much more substantial. In science, theories represent the best of what we know, and as we learn more information, we constantly critique the theory, change it if need be, or throw it out altogether. So the theory of natural selection has a lot of evidence to support it, and as time goes on, we continue to accumulate more and more evidence for it. As we begin to look at the evidence that supports the idea of natural selection and the relatedness of organisms, one of the key pieces of evidence we need to look at is the fossil record. Fossils provide us with a great opportunity to look at the organisms that used to live in the past. They can tell us all kinds of things. So by looking at fossils, we can see the sequence that new organisms came to be, new adaptations. We can tell that in part because of where fossils are in the rock layer. Generally, the deeper you go into the rock, the older the fossils are. And then we can confirm that with dating of the fossils that can determine how old the fossil is and how old the rock is. By doing so, we can track the emergence and the loss of different species in the fossil record, and we can see when new traits came to be. And an ancestral trait is a trait that was found in an organism's ancestors, whereas a derived trait is a new trait, in other words, something new to that organism. By comparing this allows us to determine the relatedness of organisms, because we can see who had what trait and when. A great example of this is the discovery of the Archaeopteryx fossil. I don't know if you can tell from the picture, but the Archaeopteryx fossil is actually a dinosaur fossil. But what you can see over here and over here are evidence that this animal had feathers. So it was one of the first and biggest components that gave us a clue that modern-day birds are actually related to dinosaurs. In fact, there's been so many fossil records found that some paleontologists consider birds to be living dinosaurs. Let's take a minute and review that idea. Comparing the anatomy of organisms also gives us good ideas about who's related to whom. The main way that we're going to look at that is what organisms have homologous structures. A homologous structure is a trait that, although they may appear different, are actually similar because organisms share a common ancestor. A really great example of that is something called a pennadactyl limb. And basically what that means is if we look at the arm of various organisms, vertebrates, or in other words, animals that have bones, we can see that the human arm, the whale fin, the bat wing, the horse leg, all of those are organisms that have a similar bone structure. Before I go on to explain this, I just want to point out that not all structures that are similar are homologous. So for example, a dolphin's body looks very much like a fish's body, but they are not homologous. They don't have a common ancestor that shares the trait. Let's go back to the pennadactyl limb. If we take a look, we've got a human, a bird, a porpoise, and an elephant. All four animals use their arm for very different purposes, yet they all have a similar structure. We have this bone up here, which is called the humerus. followed by two smaller bones, the radius and ulna, followed by carpals, which are the wrist bones, metacarpal hand bones, and then phalanges, the finger bones. And even though, in the case such as the bird, those bones have changed shape greatly, we see that they all still have the same bone makeup. And that's true not only for the animals listed, but a lot of, well, actually almost all terrestrial vertebrates. Thus showing that these guys have some kind of common ancestry that has gotten different to adapt to niches, but has some kind of similarities back in their bones. Let's take a moment and review that idea. Another piece of evidence that supports the theory of natural selection is the identification of vestigial structures. So, a vestigial structure is a type of homologous structure because it's inherited and it's changed in form from the ancestral form. However, the change in form is in the case of vestigial structures, is it's becoming reduced. So, in other words, the ancestor had a functional version, and modern day organisms have a reduced form. There are a lot of examples. Humans actually have a fair number. Pythons actually have leg bones, as do whales. Humans have a fair number of vestigial structure, including the little pink part in the corner of your eye and the appendix. So if we take a look at an x-ray of a whale, we see that there's actually some remnant bones of what look like used to be legs. So they have a pelvis and a femur. Both, though, are so small that they do not protrude from the whale's body. Well, how did he get this? For a trait to become vestigial, it's important that the structure does not provide any advantage to the organism. So in other words, the organism is not going to be any more likely to survive or reproduce with the trait. In fact, organisms who have a smaller version of the trait would have had some reason to be successful. So, for example, in the case of the whale, if the animal was swimming a lot and it was swimming primarily with its tail or with its legs, in the case of the whale, it would be its tail, then those back legs might have just gotten in the way. In fact, they might have disrupted the hydrodynamics of the animal. And so once reduced, there would have been a selective pressure to make it smaller and smaller. And then it still has the tailbones because now there's no advantage or disadvantage to having them. So there's no reason for them to get any smaller or bigger. It is important to note that there are still some vestigial structures that have minor importance. So a good example of that would be the human appendix. Some argue that the appendix is important because it is a storage area for helpful gut bacteria. But lots and lots of people have their appendix removed without causing any problem whatsoever. And so by and large, the human appendix is considered vestigial. Let's take a look at the whale. So the ancestor of the whale is believed to be this kind of dog-like looking thing. And as we see some intermediate species, in other words, species between the dog-like looking ancestor and the modern day whale, we see several species that would have spent more and more time in the water. As you look at those back legs are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And a body form of something like this second to last one here, if it's propelling itself with its tail, these little tiny puny legs sticking out would not have offered much help against the flow of water over its body. Now that the legs are small, there's no reason for them to get any smaller because they're no longer impeding the flow of water. As I mentioned, humans have a lot of vestigial structures. The pink part of our eye, the muscles that control our movement of our ear. Not too many people can move their ears anymore, but we don't need to. It doesn't offer us an evolutionary advantage at all. The loss of hair in our body, we don't need to tear our food with our teeth anymore. So we still have a pointed canine, but it's much smaller than, say, a dog's canine or a cat's canine. Let's take a moment and review. Many of the pieces of evidence that we use today to support the theory of natural selection was available to Darwin. However, there's a lot of new stuff that he did not have access to simply because of when he was living. One of them is embryology. Embryology just refers to what an organism looks like before it's born as it develops from a fertilized egg. So an embryo is just a pre-birth stage of development. And vertebrate embryos, when you look at them, whether they're a mammal, a bird, a reptile, even fish, have a very similar embryonic structures. They all look pretty much the same and go through similar stages. We have a lot of the same parts. In fact, what makes a vertebrate members of the same phylum or grouping of animals is four structures that we don't even find once you're born. We only have them in the embryo stage. And this similarity supports the idea that all of these, or all vertebrates, came from a common ancestor to have those traits. Of course, the strongest pieces of evidence that we now have that Darwin didn't comes from biochemistry. So when we look at organisms, all organisms have a similar cellular structure. So even when we go back as far as bacteria, all cells have many structures in common, having cytoplasm, having a cell wall, being made of DNA, and that points to a relatedness of organisms. Not only do we have the same structures, but we use the same molecules. So all living things use DNA and RNA and enzymes and have cytoplasm, use similar organelles, etc. Remember, organelles, the fancier ones, are only found in eukaryotes. But all organisms have those same basic components. And when we look at our DNA, of all the possible things that exist, all of life only has 4 different bases. Remember, that's why they weren't even sure DNA controlled life for a while, because it seems so simple with just the 4 different bases. And all of life is controlled by 20 amino acids. There's a lot more than 20 amino acids, but living things only use 20 of them, and we all have the same code. The codon chart that you use in our DNA unit works for whether you're talking about bacteria or human beings. And all organisms, when they need to exchange energy for doing a reaction in their bodies, do so with ATP. And finally, what in my mind is the most important bit of evidence is the idea of DNA testing. We can, as we've already talked about, compare 2 people and say, hey, those 2 people are related, they have the same mom and dad. Or, hey, those 2 people are more related than other members of their population. They're probably in the same family, cousins or second cousins or something like that. We can do that not only for individuals to say, hey, those 2 people are related because they have similar DNA, but also for whole species. So we can compare the DNA of, say, a bonobo, which looks a little bit like a chimpanzee, to a chimpanzee and see just in fact how much they have in common with each other and even with humans. Turns out bonobos and chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. If we take a look, we can see as we go away from us here, we get this is just one particular amino acid, one particular protein. And as we go away from us in how similar organisms are, we see that we get increasingly larger differences in our amino acids and therefore our DNA. So a monkey and a human, who are far more closely related to each other than, say, a human and a turtle, a monkey and a human have a lot more in common and a lot fewer differences. Let's take a moment and review that. The last piece of evidence to deciding what organisms are more closely related is their geographic distribution, or in other words, their biogeography, which is just a fancy way of saying where organisms live. Location is going to determine with whom an organism can mate. So, for example, a squirrel in your backyard is not going to be mating with a squirrel in the South Rim of the Grand Canyon. And so that's going to affect whose traits get passed down. It's not entirely random. They're mating with organisms nearby. So what we find is organisms are going to be more closely related to organisms that live nearby. So that squirrel is going to be more closely related to another squirrel in the neighborhood than a squirrel in the Grand Canyon. A good example of this is when we look at the animals of Australia. The koala bear, the one in the middle, may look a lot more like this bear over here hanging from the tree. But it's far more closely related to this wombat, which to me looks kind of like a tired pig, because they're both marsupials and they've both been isolated on the island continent of Australia, whereas this is a North American bear. Let's take one more moment and review. That's it for this video note session. As always, come see me if you have any questions.